Okay, let's talk about George Orwell, one of the big
Well, I mean,
influentials,
I think that
public
the very
intellectuals.
important thing about George Orwell is I've written about him. I wrote a thing that came out in the Village magazine in relation to him and an American writer called Upton Sinclair, and I wrote a thing on Brexit recently, which dealt with Orwell in detail. He's come right back into focus. He was never quite out of focus, but the reasons are, if you look at his essays in particular, and his novels are more famous, but the essays in particular. One, he has a commitment to the ability of how to express yourself, both in language, crisply, precisely, exactly, and honestly, and a hatred of doublespeak and dishonesty and propaganda, which in his famous novel 1984 becomes what he calls doublespeak. And the world is full of doublespeak: spin doctors, quacks, public relations gurus, politicians lying through their teeth or mangling things in corporate sound bites and corporate garbage. And Orwell's forensic focus on how you use plain language plainly, exactly, precisely, and sticking to the facts, which is another thing that Orwell is very. He was a journalist as well as being a civil servant and novelist. The importance of fact and also a grounded empiricism as opposed to these abstractions of ideology. So when you see a word that he condemns, like doublespeak, which is his famous expression in 1984, the world is full of this, and the world has always been full of corporate interests and governmental interests masking their infamy and often murder in these abstract technical phrases. The Nazis coined the phrase evacuation for the liquidation of the Jews in the Wannsee Conference, for example, or ethnic cleansing, or regime change, or any of the psychobabble that politicians spin doctors, or economic stabilization, which in effect means austerity and liquidation, or banking stabilization. These accountants, bean counters, and corporatocrats and politicians use language in a way that Orwell would disapprove. Now, the other thing about Orwell is his faith in the common man. He was basically a working class person, and of course, he lived quite a bohemian existence at certain points in time. And his belief in the inherent decency of the common man. But coupled with that is his distrust of populism and popular prejudice, racism and xenophobia. And he had experienced quite a bit of it in his life. And there's a famous story, he was a civil servant in Burma. And there's a famous story that he wrote about the way the British colonial establishment treated Burmese. And this was a man with very strong antenna-raisers to racism. So although he's in favour of the common man and populism, he's not in favour of the common man's racism. But why that's relevant to the present day and age is that people like Steve Bannon, Trump, and to a lesser extent Brexit, I suppose, and also all the crypto-fascist leaders throughout Europe and maybe even Frank in Ireland, a minor Mussolini form of crypto-fascist, minor Mussolini form, are appealing to a kind of naked populism. And Gemma O'Doherty, who ran for president of Ireland, stoked up all this hatred of the other and racism intrinsic in her presidential run. Orwell therefore had no belief in popular prejudice morphing into nationalism, which he despised, chauvinism, which he despised, and racism. So he's relevant to this day and age for that reason as well. He's also relevant for his hatred of extremism, which is crucially relevant to this day and age. I mean, Animal Farm is often regarded as a parable against Stalinism, and at one level it was, but Orwell had seen both sides of the extreme when he was in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. And the homage to Catalonia is about, at one level, the extremism of the left, but also there's the extremism of fascism on the right. And we're entering an age of extremism. And extremists don't have boundaries, they don't stick to facts. They use the population as a source of exploitation and brainwashing. And in our consumer world today, that's what's happening. Orwell should, I think, be coupled with Aldous Huxley and his book Brave New World in this kind of desanitized consumerist culture of a population completely disconnected from any democratic input, moorless and rudderless, feeling that they're voiceless and can't achieve anything, and being brainwashed by the gods of consumerism, which achieve ultimately nothing for them. So Orwell, in his distrust of ideology and his commitment to fact, in his hatred of extremism, and in his upholding of the common man's interests without giving in to popular prejudices such as racism, in his dislike of nationalism, and which has become an endemic feature of this age as transnational entities fragment, the European Union breaks up, and the whole international experiment fragments. Orwell cautions against chauvinism and nationalism, which leads to the hatred of the other and, of course, to racism. For all of those reasons, and there's an article of mine coming out of that on coming out in two weeks. He has come right back into focus as one of the central public intellectuals of our age. How long was that?